Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Secret History of History, Three Ordinary Girls. I'm Amanda Olkey. I am the Director of Adult Education at the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm delighted that we have Tim Brady with us here to discuss his fantastic new book about the remarkable story of three Dutch teenagers who became spies, saboteurs, and Nazi assassins. In addition to this new book, and I have the galley, so I really got it hot off the pre-presses. Tim is the author of several notable books, including his father's son, The Life of Theodore Roosevelt Jr. He also helped develop the Peabody Award-winning series Liberty, The American Revolution for PBS. When I learned about the book, Three Ordinary Girls, I thought this would be a fantastic program for Women's History Month, and Tim helped us make that so. I've really enjoyed reading it, and I'm looking forward to the presentation. We will get to questions after Tim gives us some cool insight into this story. Anyway, enough from me. Tim, we can't thank you enough, and I am going away now for a little bit.
Thank you, Amanda. It's an honor and a privilege to be here. I'm so glad I was asked to come. I'm going to do a description of the book and then maybe read a few pages and give you a sense of what it's about before we take questions. Three Ordinary Girls is the story of three young women who became fighters in the Dutch resistance after the German invasion of the Netherlands in May 1940. When I call them ordinary, I don't mean that they weren't individual, that they didn't have their own unique characteristics, their quirks, their likes and dislikes. Instead, what I want to suggest is how drastic were the changes about to come to their lives. In a matter of months, these young women, whose daily lives were typical for young people in North Holland at the start of the German occupation, were about to become integral members of the Dutch resistance and ultimately assassins. They would begin to risk everything that they loved and cherished in their lives. They would soon be risking their freedom, their families, their very lives for causes that had been largely theoretical to them a few months earlier. Understanding just how and why this happened was the chief animating force behind this book, and in the end, it became the story itself. Two of the girls were teenage sisters from Haarlem, a city not far from Amsterdam in North Holland. Truus, the older of the two, was just 16 years old at the time of the invasion. Freddie, her younger sister, was only 14. The two had grown up in a working class, politically active household in Haarlem. The father left the family when the girls were quite young, leaving them with their mother, Truus, a strong-willed, independent woman, an active member of the local Communist Party. The family experienced the hardships of the Great Depression as the girls grew up, periodically going on the dole to make ends meet. Their education and social lives were wrapped up in the political leanings of their mother, whose friends and acquaintances were largely members of the party. The girls went to summer camps with children of other leftists. They read inspirational stories of life in the Soviet Union, and from an early age helped trying to distribute party newspaper and flyers. The family was also part of a communist-founded organization called Red Aid, which assisted refugees. I'm going to back up here, and I'm going to pause here and give you a few photos. The two sisters are Freddie on the left, the younger sister, Truus on the right, the older sister. This is Truus. This is Freddie. I'm going to repeat myself a little bit here. The girls went to summer camps with the children of other leftists. They read inspirational stories of life in the Soviet Union. From an early age, helped trying to distribute party newspapers and flyers. The family was also part of a communist-founded organization called Red Aid, which assisted refugees from political oppression. As early as 1934, they took in individuals and families from Hitler's Germany, both communists and Jews. The girls were fiercely anti-fascist and fiercely anti-Nazi before the Germans crossed the border into the Netherlands. That's another picture of Freddie, the younger sister. The third ordinary girl was Hannie Schaft, born in 1920, which made her a few years older than the sisters. She too was raised in Haarlem, but had no connections with the Oversteegen family prior to the war. This is Hannie is the youngest of the two girls here. Her parents were Peter and Aftra Schaft. Peter was a teacher at an academy in the city, and like the Oversteegens, had a strong attraction to socialist politics. He wrote occasional essays and articles for Dutch socialist newspapers. The Schafts had an older daughter, Annie, who died during an outbreak of diphtheria when Hannie was just 5 years old. That's Hannie, the older sister here. With the death of this oldest girl, the Schafts became extremely protective of Hannie. Her friends and relatives recall her being bundled in layer upon layer of clothing, even in mild weather, to protect against chills. Hannie's most distinguishing feature was a flowing head of red hair. It made her conspicuous among her schoolmates, and she was both teased and admired for the mane. The red hair would distinguish her for all her days, even to the Nazis, who would one day pursue her. Hannie was a good student with a particular interest, like her father, in progressive history. When it came time to go off to college, Hannie chose to attend the University of Amsterdam to study law. In Amsterdam, she met new friends and almost immediately began to feel a sense of freedom beyond her parents' helicoptering style. She soon moved into an apartment, helped found a club of politically like-minded female friends, including two Jewish girls who would quickly become her closest acquaintances. She volunteered to collect donations from refugees for the Civil War in Spain. And when Germany invaded Poland in the fall of 1939, she sent Red Cross parcels to Polish soldiers captured by the invaders. When the Germans arrived in the Netherlands in 1940, the Dutch were ill prepared for the invasion. They had escaped the brutality of the First World War by declaring their neutrality in the conflict. Germany had bypassed the country on its way to Belgium and France, and the hope was that they would do so again in the Second War. That didn't happen. Just 5 days after the Wehrmacht crossed the border, the country was theirs. The Queen and the cabinet of the Dutch Republic fled to London. The army surrendered, and in the final act of brutality, the Germans bombed the city of Rotterdam when the Dutch failed to sign their terms of surrender quickly enough. The devastation of Rotterdam was the first indicator of what the air power of the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, could do to a modern European city in the war. The Germans quickly established an occupying government in the Netherlands, headed by a bland Nazi bureaucrat named Arthur Seyss-Inquart. The Nazis tried to put a friendly face on the occupation at the start, expressing the hope that their Dutch cousins would come to see the wisdom of fascist governance. Soon enough, however, the oppressions of the new regime were revealed, beginning, as they usually did with the Nazis, with restrictions on the Jewish population of the Netherlands. Bans on Jews holding public office became bans on Jews in restaurants, movie theaters, and public parks. The registry of Jews followed, and soon after, rough groups of native Dutch fascists began to bully and intimidate Jews in the streets. Inevitably, there was a murderous fight, and one of the fascists was killed in a melee. He was immediately turned into a martyr by the occupiers, who cordoned off the Jewish sector of Amsterdam, rounded up some 425 Jewish likely suspects, and sent them off to concentration camps. This treatment of its Jewish citizenry genuinely shocked the Dutch people, who had obviously known of the Gestapo treatment of Jews in Germany and Eastern Europe, but somehow assumed, but somehow it assumed that the treatment, somehow assumed that they wouldn't be so murderous in their treatment of Dutch Jews. To protest what was being done, communist laborers organized a strike in February 1941, which would have the distinction of being the only strike in a German occupied country prompted by the treatment of Jews in all of Europe during World War II. The response of the Reich was predictable. Mass arrests, roundups to the camps, and executions followed. The uprising was quickly quelled, and the general populace returned to deeply intimidated calm. For some, however, including the three ordinary girls, these actions prompted an altogether different response. It wasn't immediate. They didn't all at once decide to tuck pistols into their overcoats and go looking for SS officers. But in time, they would join a growing resistance. They would steal ID documents from the pockets of German soldiers. They would continue to distribute banned newspapers. They would bicycle around North Holland spying on the construction of German batteries and missile sites. They would distinguish themselves as they would disguise themselves as Red Cross nurses to help transport Jewish refugee children from harm's way to safe locations. They would transport weapons between resistance cells, and they would place bombs at power plants and sabotage German trains trying to take Dutch belongings from Holland to Germany. I'm going to show you, this is, I'm going to show some images now. This is Truus on the left and Hannie on the right. Oftentimes, when they went out together on these either spying expeditions or actions for the resistance, they would go as a couple, and Truus would tuck her hair up underneath a cap, and they would, and Hannie would ride on double on the bicycle. They would. This is them in that mode. Anyone who's been to the Netherlands knows how important bicycles are to life there, and it was no different, and perhaps even more so during the war. This was the chief means of transportation for the girls, and so the bikes were very important to them, and periodically the Germans would come through and seize bicycles from the Dutch populace. This is an image of Truus repairing her bike. It was very difficult to get parts for bikes during the war, and oftentimes they wound up just riding on rims because it was so hard to rubber for tires. Oops, I'm going back a little bit here. There was also a love interest here. I'm missing. I goofed up a little bit here. I meant to show an image that Amanda has sent me from a spy museum exhibit that is a blueprint of a V2 weapon. One of the spying ventures that the girls undertook was looking for V2 missile sites that were set up in Holland in the last couple of years of the war. These, of course, the V2s were, of course, the very powerful rockets that the Germans hoped would be the turning weapon in the war. And one of the towns not far from The Hague, probably a 25 or 30-minute bike ride to the southwest for the girls was Waseda, and it was near the North Sea, and the girls would bike down there, look on missions to look for these missile sites. And as it turned out, the first V2 rocket that was ever launched was launched from Waseda in the Netherlands. And,
Tim, we're at the end. We'll pull up and show off our V2 blueprint.
Okay, great. You'll get a better sense of what I'm talking about here. Anyway, there was one more facet to the girls' resistance that distinguishes them from all others, really, or almost all others. Beginning in the middle of the resistance and continuing to its very end, these girls would lay in wait for potential Nazi targets and pedal their bicycles after these targets and shoot to kill both German soldiers and Dutch collaborators. This last item is a distinction that should stand out. In Western Europe during World War II, thousands of women participated in acts of resistance against the Nazis on a daily basis. But the number of women, let alone teenagers, who actually picked up weapons and fired them at the enemy was just a fraction of a fraction. As it turned out, these girls were anything but ordinary. I'm going to take a sip of water, and then I'm going to. Whoops! This is why I wanted to show this image. This is one of their targets, Paquet Christ, and this is the aftermath of one of their actions.
That's one of those ride-by shootings, which was amazing to read about, Tim, that the Dutch had become specialists in shooting from bicycle.
Yes.
I mean, that is incredible.
It is incredible. They practiced it as well. You know, as anyone who's ridden a bicycle, which I guess is almost all of us, knows it's no easy feat to shoot and aim it. I would, when I first heard about this, it reminded me of Plains Indians who became such masters at using bows and arrows and rifles on the backs of their horses. It was really some, as I said, they would practice with their shooting out in the countryside. Yes, they use the bicycles as a means to track down and assassinate. I'm going to show you one more slide. This is Frans van der Veer, and he's going to be one of the principal characters in this section of the novel. Frans van der Veer was the head of the Haarlem resistance cell of the girls. This is how he recruited sisters. Like most sisters, Truus and Fredy did not always get along. Truus, as the older of the two, was more assertive and dictatorial and felt she was entitled to boss Fredy around. Fredy, on the other hand, was eager to display her independence. She had grown into a pretty young woman with soft curls in her hair, a dimpled chin, and a smile that was both mischievous and fetching. She moved with the lightness of a dancer and flitted about Haarlem like a sprite on the bicycle. Truus was more of a tomboy than her younger sister, particularly when she put her hair up under a cap to bite. Her mannerisms were like a guy. She would sit with her knees apart, taking more than her share of space on the couch, while Freddie's legs were always carefully crossed and unobtrusive. The truth was that Fredy could be an annoying little sister, a bit of a tag-along, and more than one willing to let Truus take the lead when it suited her, the better to carp at her decisions later on. And Truus could be a bit of a bully with the casual arrogance of a big sister. Still, they worked well together and were usually of a like mind on most matters, including when Franz Vanderbilt showed up at the front door. Tall and slim, and wearing a fedora and long wool coat over jacket and tie, both could appreciate his movie star looks. It was Treincha who went to the door at his nod. She knew who he was through her parted connections and immediately left to let him in. Meanwhile, Truus and Fredy were peeking through the sliding glass doors to the entryway, whispering and elbowing each other. They tried to be cool when their mother opened the doors and introduced him to her daughters. Franz was quite formal, taking off his hat and shaking first Truus's hand, then Fredy's. He introduced himself, and much to Truus's chagrin, she didn't want to seem déplacé, sat in the lumpiest chair in their living room. She and Fredy were surprised when their mother excused herself and left the girls alone with their bits. The reasons quickly became apparent when Franz announced the purpose of his visit. He was putting together a resistance group in Haarlem and had heard from members of the party that Truus and Fredy were intrepid activists in the movement. What he had in mind was a lot more subversive, a lot more violent, a lot more dangerous than anything they had been doing before. Their tasks would include acts of sabotage and the use of weapons. He mentioned the Russian partisans as an example of the sort of organization he had in mind. First rule of the group would be that they could not breathe a word of what they were doing to anyone, not even to their mother. In the Soviet Union, women and girls had been fighting the Germans since the invasion began. The Huns typically underestimated women, and the last thing they expected was for young women to be fighters. It would make Truus and Fredy especially valuable for the Dutch cause. Truus and Fredy might be called upon to blow up bridges and trains. They would have to learn how to use a pistol, throw grenades, and detonate bombs. Franz lit a cigarette and fixed the girls with a sobering stare. He asked, "You think you could shoot someone?" It was an extraordinary question to put to two teenage girls. Then again, with Holland occupied by a foreign nation, streets filled with black-shirted thugs and helmeted Germans roaring around on motorcycles and sidecars. These were hardly ordinary times. Fredy was first to respond. "I've never done that before," she pleaded out. This being obvious already. Truus was more circumspect, genuinely considering the question, as if she had been mulling over the possibility for a long time. And in fact, both of the Oversteegen sisters had been reared on the fringes of radical political behavior. It had been part of their mother and father's political lifestyle from infancy. She thought about the day earlier that year when she and her friend Ari were being followed. If she had had a weapon and they had been apprehended by the man in the shadows, what would she have done? Would she have been able to pull the trigger? Yes, she told Franz. She thought she could kill a real fascist, a swine who takes people from their homes to have them executed. But she hesitated over other possibilities. Not all German soldiers were Nazis, after all. Franz assured her crisply that in his resistance group, it would make certain that any executions would be Gestapo, blatant traitors. There would be no mistakes. He mentioned the Boozers, first Dutch resistance. He said that they'd been betrayed from within. There might be circumstances when the girls would be asked to take action against one of their fellow Dutch citizens, traitor to the cause. They do that. As for the idea that not all Germans were bad, Franz was almost contemptuous. Nazis controlled Germany and they had invaded Holland. They actually thought they were being kind to the Dutch. But what was to come would only get worse. They would cut back on liberties, they would reduce food and clothing, they would take everything wasn't nailed down. The interview came to an end when Franz stood up. Sound of shuffling chairs brought Trencher back to the living room. Acting formal again, he tipped his hat and bid the girl's mother adieu. Truus and Freddie walked into the door, where he whispered that he'd need an answer in 2 days. He added an ominous note. Once they were in the group, there would be no turning back. That is my selection.
Well, Tim, I really want to compliment you in reading the book. It's very, very approachable, and you really feel like we can't imagine what it was like to live under these conditions during World War II with the Nazis occupying the town. But, you know, the way you take it step by step and like the losses as they compound and how people lose hope or the girls take incredibly more risks. And it is really amazing. And I think before I jump into my questions, I think that Hannah is going to share with us, if she can, our V2 blueprint.
Oh, great.
Which will be cool to see. And then we'll jump over into questions. So this is one of the things the girls are biking around, doing recon. I mean, it's just fascinating. Everybody's on bikes. It had such an interesting quality to this story, and they're looking at the launch sites for the V2.
They're trying to locate basically, and it wasn't easy biking there. It was like I think 30 miles is pretty accurate for the distance between Haarlem and the Hague. It might be a little farther than that. It was near the coast, so there was always a chilling wind that they either going or coming they would be biking into. So it wasn't an easy day to pedal down and then have to encounter German troops who were wondering what you were doing down on the coast. So.
Yeah, I mean, it was so interesting to have a chance to share this blueprint, which we have on display in our analysis gallery, but it's under heavy protective glass because it's fun to be able to share this, because this was the big, you know, Hitler's big vengeance weapon, and everyone was trying to figure out what it was. So thanks for that, Hannah. Thanks for bringing that up for us. And then, so there was so much riding around on bikes and doing things that end up being incredibly significant. And then also these journeys where towards the end where they're having to, turns out they're taking cigarettes to girlfriends of this kind of bourgeoisie element in the resistance. And I'm impressed at how, I don't know if you want to comment on how these girls managed to keep their attitudes intact. Teenagers are not famous for great attitudes, and maybe that's just later on, but how did they keep up their spirits?
Well, they had their down moments, obviously, as anyone would under those circumstances. But you know, I think that part of it was the camaraderie they had among themselves, and I you know, their dedication was both to the cause, the resistance cause, and to each other, and so I think you know that this is Haarlem is a relatively small community. It's you know it's a community, and there are so many little Dutch communities that surround Haarlem and Amsterdam and the industrial areas to the north and towards the North Sea to the west. They're all little communities, and they all have their interest in each other and in the community and in North Holland itself. So it's you know there are all sorts of allegiances that help. stoke them and keep their spirits up and keep their eye on the prize, which was liberation.
And you had just queued up Franz there at the end, and you described their meeting with him. So he does a lot of loyalty tests with people that folks who read the book can learn more about. But I wondered how you felt from this perspective of, many, many years. What do you think of these tests that he would do?
Well, actually, as I should say that much of the details of the inner workings of the resistance cell came directly from Truus, the memoir that she wrote, and the other chief tool that I used was a book by a Dutch journalist named Ton Koers, which was a biography of Hannie Schaft. So I have to bow to them when I answer a question to this, because when I read about these encounters, I thought of it as sort of, in some cases, actual comic relief, because there was this was a very small, the Haarlem RVV, which was the resistance cell that the girls belonged to. It's really just a handful of people for the most part of the war. And one of the first meetings that they had was undertaken in a Dutch park, a Haarlem park, and they were just basically hanging out in the park, discussing how they could get weaponry, because one of the very early problems was they had no weapons, and the chief source of weapons in the area was the Germans themselves, and so they were always plotting how to get weapons from Germans, and
that's one of the questions that's coming in about the guns and ammo. So if you want to elaborate a little bit on that, that would be great.
I will. That was. I'm going to finish this story quickly and to say that at that meeting in the park, this was what they were discussing, but Franz wanted them to have a cover in case someone happened by and questioned what they were doing, and so he said, no, if someone comes by, let's pretend to be members of an exercise club, which always, and you have to picture this group. Franz is probably, Franz is, I think, probably in his early 30s or late 20s. The girls are, they're these teenage girls. And then there's a hard-handed bricklayer who's in probably his 40s or 50s, who are the central to the group at an exercise club. So yeah, I just sort of, there's in the Truus story, there's no, that is not written with much irony, but when I read it, I kind of smiled to myself thinking, yeah, that's going to fly. So, do you want me to elaborate on the weaponry a little bit now?
Yeah. That's people are curious how, and they're wonderful. I shouldn't say wonderful, but they're really cool photos of Hannie with a Sten gun, I think, later on.
That would have been very, very late in the war, because those were Allied weapons, and I think they were brought. Those were probably posed to suggest they had more weaponry than they did. And at the start of the war, back when they first building a resistance movement, they really didn't. One of the weapons that they brought to their little circle was an Indonesian kris, which is a knife with a twisted blade, just a mean-looking tool. But that was they had they had as their weaponry. Again, this is the Haarlem cell. They had a pistol that had been buried in someone's backyard, some veteran of the Dutch army who didn't want to give it up when the Germans came in and buried it in the backyard, that they dug that up, and Truus commented that it came from the Stone Ages. It was so old and rusted. And the other weapon was this kris with the curvy blade that looks like a horn of a kind of a unicorn single blade spiraling blade. Anyway, they didn't have much weaponry. So one of the things they set out to do very early on was to take weapons from Germans, take pistols from Germans, and that meant taking this old pistol and shooting a German with working, functioning German pistol, swiping both the uniform of the German and the pistol and applying that to their resistance work.
So folks are interested, a couple questions related to the Jewish population in the Netherlands. First question, any crossover with Anne Frank?
I use her the outline of her story basically as kind of a touchstone. I should say that this book was written with an American audience in mind. I'm going to say that right up front. I wanted to, I knew that this story would be not so familiar to an American audience, so I wanted to bring it to that audience. And I knew that Anne Frank Anne Frank's is the most signature. Her story is a signature story of the Netherlands during World War II. So and she was in Amsterdam, not far from where Hannie was going to school. So it was easy to insert her in her circumstances. Again, just a sort of a touchstone.
Right.
With the reference and paint the picture.
One person asks that 3/4 of the Dutch Jews were murdered during the Second World War, which were higher numbers than in other Western European countries. Do you have thoughts about why?
Well, I'm not going to suggest exactly why. It's a number that I think is familiar to people who are familiar with the circumstances of the war in the Netherlands, and I think that I think people in the Netherlands I don't know too much. I think they're embarrassed by that those numbers, and I think part of it, the reason that it happened was, I should say that there was a bounty program.
There was what? I missed that.
A bounty program. People could turn in Jews for a bounty. There was an initial, what happened was that there was an initial sweep that took the majority of the Jewish population. This occurred from the summer of 1942 through the end of the year of 1942. Afterward, there were many Jews who were hiding out, and they were called sort of underdwellers in Dutch, hidden by Dutch fellows and under their own circumstances, like Anne Frank, and there was sort of a kind of a never-ending search for these figures with it, and that's when the bounty system began to take root and people begin.
I lost you a little bit.
Well, I don't know exactly what the amounts were and what put a bounty on a particular Jewish family or Jew was, but it was it was a gruesome, horrible set of circumstances.
Folks want to know, was the Dutch resistance, were they in contact with other resistance efforts in Europe? Were they in touch with the British intelligence service? And that could have changed over time, I'm sure.
There was some connection. I'm not going to be a great expert on this. My knowledge of the Dutch resistance was focused on this Haarlem cell. I will tell you that the Dutch resistance was very loosely organized resistance, and there were cells like the Haarlem cells in communities all over the Netherlands, and it was only after the invasion and an attempt by the Dutch government in exile to put some controls on the resistance, some organization on the resistance, that it became more organized. And prior to that, there were different facets. There was the RVV, which was the most violent of the resistance cells. Probably there was the LO, which was like Corrie ten Boom. It was an organization that chiefly served as a way to hide and feed the underdrivers, the underdrivers. I'm sorry, I swallow my Dutch. But the people who were in the underground hiding out, and the people who were being hidden by the people in the Netherlands. There were also, there were facets of people who were doing. There was one. There were people doing forgery, making fake documents, and all of these different facets of the resistance were pretty loosely spread out over the cities and the countryside. And as I say, late in the war, after the Allied invasion, the Dutch government in London at the time tried to put the rein on the various activities and put some controls.
Yeah, someone was asking about an instance where all three girls performed an act of espionage, and I think, in just as you're describing this and reading the book, it was so intriguing to see what all fell under the umbrella of the resistance. And, so they were maybe not all doing espionage, but they certainly did some operations altogether.
Yes, yeah, they would go out especially late in the war, they would go out as a team, sort of. And one of the more hair-raising adventures that the three had was trying to blow up a bridge. The Germans were trying to move as much, like factory equipment and manufacturing equipment from the Netherlands to Germany via train. And they would just load up the train and send it east toward Germany. And so there was a plan to blow up a bridge in Haarlem. And so the three girls were sent out on their own, and with really their training in demolition was not thorough, shall we say. So they were going out on this girder bridge and and the river rushing below them, and periodic German troops marching over to guard the bridge, marching over and back to guard the bridge,
it's
and
hair raising the way.
was,
I mean, the way you describe it in the book, it's just incredible.
and Freddie, who the youngest, was always sort of given the lookout role, and so she was on one end of the bridge looking out, and she had to deal with a guard dog, and Truus and Hannie were edging out on the girded bridge to set the explosives, and it was pretty wild, and they ultimately failed on that expedition.
That was the thing. There's so many operations that are, so difficult. Their lives are at risk. Other people's lives are at risk, and their successes and their failures. And it just, they just keep going. And that people have do you want to comment, or do you want to say buy the book on whether the girls survived the war or were?
I'll tell you that the sisters survived, which I guess gives it all away when I say that. But I think it's very interesting. Their fate through the course of the war is quite interesting. And if I tell you that I got interested in the book when I saw the obituary of the youngest sister in the New York Times in 2018, Freddie's obituary, then you'll know that she lived a long life, survived into her 90s.
Well, that leads in talking about the book. One of our guests wants to know, what was your favorite part of researching for this book? Was there anything that you found out that was super shocking?
Well, I wouldn't say shocking. I would say surprising. When you're when you tackle a subject like this, you always the initial interest was spurred by all of this talk of teenage assassins, young women assassins, and my instinct as an old jaded writer is to say, oh yeah, sure, because there's got to be something more to this. I mean, the story is just too interesting at the outset to be fully true. What the biggest surprise was to me was that it was more so than I thought it would be. That I truly was skeptical that when I dug into the story that I would find that these young women were actually pulling the trigger, because it's just a hair-raising path. The whole outline of being an assassin is just to say the least, it's not something you take lightly.
And two questions related to that. One, where did they practice shooting? And two, and you sort of alluded to this, but how regularly were assassinations planned, or were they just for high value targets?
The first question, they had Haarlem has many little dense woods within the community itself. One which happened to be right next to the resistance hangout, and which was a home of quite a well-known sculptor in the city. And they would go into the woods and practice there. They also later on the geography of the area to the west and the north, the coastline of the North Sea offers ample opportunity to get out to the dunes and they would practice riding their bikes in the dunes, and they would do shooting out there too. What was the second part of the question?
How routine were the assassinations, or were they regularly scheduled, or was it just very high value sort of targets?
It depended. Late in the war, the targets came fast and furious, and it was one of the things you would think that it would sort of that it wouldn't be so, that there would be sort of a respite as things quieted down. But in fact, what happened is, because the Netherlands were liberated so late in the war, the intensity of the last winter in the Netherlands just heightened terrifically. There was no food. People were starving, and the girls themselves were starting to feel very, very vengeful about what had happened. And so by this stage they were working in conjunction with a group of people who were sort of latecomers to the local resistance, and the girls were taking directions more immediately from them and taking from France Mandeville early on. So, and these people had their own vengeful targets too, and they tended, in a number of cases, they pointed girls in the direction of the target.
I had a question just about one of the assassinations in the book, which Truus claimed, but maybe didn't do it, or there was some question, and I wondered why there would be question if she said she had killed someone. Was she protecting someone else?
Well, she could have been. I can't claim, to know everything about the assassinations. I don't think anybody can. And I think if it's the one that I'm thinking of, it might be a situation where she was protecting Freddie.
That's what I wondered. Yeah.
They were, sort of jointly. They would always say, "We were soldiers." This is long after the war. They would say, "We were soldiers," and Freddie would say, "A soldier doesn't never tell us about people they killed." So they would. That was on the one hand, and the other hand, Truus, in her memoir, claims several victims that admits this shooting several.
I missed that bit.
Truus in her memoirs admits to shooting several victims, so she wasn't completely closed-mouthed about what transpired.
It really is. I find their lives, or the occurrences after the war, are very interesting. Someone wants to know, the wonderful photos that you shared, are those in the book?
Some of them are. Some of them are.
Yeah, I have the galley, so I could not answer that.
Sorry. Yeah.
Oh no, and the photos and there are wonderful images and some prurient articles too out there on the web about the women. I have one outline question as we wrap up. Guests want to know if you'd watch the Amazon series Hunters, and do you see any similarities in the research you've done about Nazi hunting in the USA versus Europe?
I do not watch Hunters. I know of it, but I don't watch it, and I really feel ill prepared to answer, to make the comparison.
That is fine, but we always like a good pop culture question around these parts. Well, Tim, I can't thank you enough. Are there any parting words that you have for us before I wrap up? Anything that we've missed in our discussion?
I just hope people pick up the book and enjoy it, and uh, and I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to everybody.
Well, I thank you for being here. You can see my many notes in the book. There are scenes, I don't want to give it away as a further teaser. I feel like there's one happy time, and that happens in a bunker where they get to celebrate. So you have to read the book to find out what I consider the one happy time. And I thank you so much, Tim, for joining us and for writing this book to tell a story that's really well known in the Netherlands, but not very well known here. I want to thank all of our fabulous guests for coming today. We love having you and having you at our programs. If you've enjoyed this one or others, I hope you'll consider contributing to the Spy Museum's Mission Resilience campaign. We have another cool program next Thursday at noon, same time as this, and it is about the secrets of indigo, and we cover indigo blue in our economic espionage gallery. So there's so many interesting connections from the V2 weapon to the color blue, but Tim, we're wearing orange for the Dutch resistance. So that's our color today. So thank you again so much.
Thanks, Amanda.
All right, everyone, take care, be well.